Hello ladies and gentlemen, this is Mr. Waples here, and this video lecture will be about all things Civil War. There are three objectives to our talk here today. First off is to understand the key events that occurred in the Civil War. Second is to understand how Lincoln expanded the federal and executive branch's power, often by overstepping his role in the Constitution. And third is to understand the impacts of the Civil War, social, economic, and political. So, buckle in, grab your guided notes, and let us get started. First off, it is important to understand President Abraham Lincoln's main goal in the start of the war, which was to preserve the Union. Do not fall for the trap asking you whether it was to free the slaves. Although that became a goal later on, it was not his initial goal before the Emancipation Proclamation. His first and most important goal was to preserve the Union. The dawn of war. As you know, there are two sides in the Civil War. We have the North versus the South. In the North's corner, which is called the Union, the United States of America, we have the President Abraham Lincoln. In the South side, we have the South, called the Confederacy, the Confederate States of America, whose president is Jefferson Davis. Advantages for both sides, and there were many and few. The Union had a much more industrial economy, which means they had more supplies, more guns, more ships. They had better transportation systems, better transportation networks of railroads. They also had a much higher population, which means more manpower in the end. On the southern side, though, the Confederacy had very strong generals. The majority of the military academies were in the South, and so they had the best trained individuals in their army. They knew the territory because they were fighting a defensive war. All they had to do was outlast. They had the potential for European allies, and they sought to court England and France throughout the war. And they were also fighting for a cause. For the South, it was about fighting for their right to exist. It was about fighting for their freedom as individuals, where the North was more about just keeping the country together. It's much easier to fight and to maintain a long fight if you're fighting for your right to exist than just to keep some people in your country. Military strategies. The North's biggest strategy was the Anaconda Plan, is what they began the war with. In this plan, they were to control the Mississippi River, they were to blockade Southern and Confederate forts, and they were to capture Richmond, Virginia, which was the Southern capital. The South's war was a war of attrition, which essentially just means outlast. The South's plan was to hold out until the North's supplies ran out and then attack. They used King Cotton diplomacy, using their cash crop of cotton. The South hoped to rely on European allies for goods during the war. Both France and Britain did declare neutrality. And although the British did not officially recognize the Confederacy, they did sell ships to fight the Union blockade. The British sold privateer ships. Key battles and events. The first battle of the Civil War was at Fort Sumter. Location was South Carolina. The date was April 12, 1861, and the victor was the Confederacy. Main outcomes and impacts. First off, the Confederacy fired first, which gave the North the moral imperative there. It marks the beginning of the war, and also it allows Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee to see there is a possibility of victory and to follow South Carolina in suit and secede from the Union, thus solidifying the South. Here's a picture of what the map looks like after those states do secede. You'll notice those states in the middle, Missouri, Kentucky, and West Virginia, and Maryland, and Delaware. They are colored both colors because they are within the North, but they are border states, and they maintain slavery despite their adherence to the North. Antietam was the bloodiest battle in the Civil War. It was located in Maryland. The date was September 1862. The victor was the Union. Major outcomes and impacts, ladies and gentlemen, it was once again the bloodiest single-day battle. The major win was for the Union. And in the end, Lincoln fires General McClellan for not being aggressive enough as the South retreated. After this, and the reason why Antietam is a huge deal is because it was the first major victory for the North, which prompted Lincoln to state the Emancipation Proclamation. This freed the slaves in rebelling states only in rebelling states. So those border states that were still part of the Union did not have to give up slavery. The reason Lincoln issued this was, one, it increased the number of Union soldiers in the North and promotes a moral cause in addition to just trying to keep the Union together. It kept border states in the Union as well. And it also maintained alliances with foreign nations, for example, Britain. Britain and France had a hard time siding with the South when slavery was brought into the issue, because as states that had abolished, as countries that had abolished slavery themselves years before, they could not side with the South for that moral imperative. Gettysburg was when the South actually took the offensive. They made it all the way up into Pennsylvania. This is July 1st through 3rd, 1862, a 3-day-long battle. The major victor was the Union, and the major outcome was that the North won the upper hand on the East Coast. 30% of soldiers from this battle died, a staggering number, thousands of men, and it was a major turning point for the battle, or turning point battle for the war. After this, the Union experienced a massive victory at Vicksburg, which is in Mississippi. It was July 4th, Independence Day, 1862. Again, the Union was the victor. And the major outcome or impact was, it was one of the last holdouts on the Mississippi River. It gives the North, or gives the Union control of the Mississippi River. It starved the Confederacy. It was an attack from both land and sea, and it led to Union control of the entire Mississippi. The South considered peace talks after this. It was that bad for them. And although they dragged on for a few more years, it was one of those moments where it took a low, low blow for the South. It also prompted the Gettysburg Address. Well, after Gettysburg, rather, which is your 407 years ago speech from Abraham Lincoln. The importance of this was that it helped Americans see the United States as a single nation, a unified nation, which once again is Lincoln's main goal. Sherman's March. The war continues. This occurred throughout Georgia and South Carolina. Sherman marches and essentially destroys everything in his path. It occurred from September 1864 all the way to March 1865. The Union was the victor. And the major outcome is Sherman goes north to meet Grant in Richmond. He uses total war, a strategy he learned about in Global, where he destroys everything in his path, from towns, houses, crops, stores, supplies, food, even railroads, as you see in this image. They bent the tracks so they could not be fixed without replacing parts. And he also promises on his march slaves 40 acres and a mule after they win if they join his army. This becomes a policy in the Homestead Act, too, with 40 acres and a mule. So don't forget that phrase. It comes back later on. And then finally, you have Appomattox, which was the last battle in the Civil War. It occurred in Virginia. Date was April 9th, 1865. And actually, the victor is the Union. Major impact is that Grant and Sherman approach Richmond. Jefferson Davis burns Richmond to the ground rather than have it fall into the hands of the North. But finally, the Confederacy surrenders, and Lincoln was generous with terms. During wartime, the economy for the North and South differed a bit. In the North, the economy grew rapidly. Remember, they were an industrial economy, and the increased demands for war supplies made their industry boom. They have rapid industrialization, but in the South, their economy suffers. Crops are destroyed, a blockade impedes imports and exports from their part, and slaves are no longer working in areas conquered by the North. The people. This was called the rich man's war and the poor man's fight because wealthy men could buy their way out of the draft. There was a draft instituted in the Civil War, although if you paid $300, you can get out of it, which was another way the North raised money. Women made themselves very useful by taking over jobs on farms while men fought, but also serving in the field as nurses to help soldiers. For African Americans, they were not allowed to join the war originally until the Emancipation Proclamation, when the North started using black regiments. Once enlisted, they faced discrimination, segregation, and lower pay than white soldiers in the Union Army. The government paid for the war using taxes. They used the first income tax. They also printed paper money, greenbacks. continue on the government. Congress during the Southern secession was extremely productive because all the opposition, those Southern senators and congressmen, had left. The Northern congressmen passed laws that favored the North. They raised the tariff, favoring Northern industry. They passed the Pacific Railway Act. And they also passed the Homestead Act, which expanded the West significantly as people moved westward. Lincoln oversteps presidential powers, justified or not. Lincoln versus the Constitution. During the Civil War, Lincoln did many things to try and hold the nation together, several of which he'd done against the law. He had taken actions that constitutionally he was not allowed to take without the permission of Congress. Although often they did support his actions afterwards when they had time to meet and actually vote on it, many of the things he did before they could do this. For example, he increased the size of the army without authorization of Congress. He withdrew $2 million for military purposes without the authorization of Congress. He also arrested and jailed anti-unionists, giving no reason without permission from Congress. That's called suspension of habeas corpus, which means you can be jailed and held indefinitely without even being told why you're there. All three of these things go against Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, which gives Congress the right to grant these things, not the president. Furthermore, Lincoln censored some anti-union newspapers and had editors and publishers arrested, which goes, as you know, against the First Amendment, and he issued the Emancipation Proclamation freeing slaves in southern states, which goes against the Supreme Court case of Dred Scott versus Sanford, issuing that slaves are property and you cannot have your property taken away from you. Impacts of the Civil War. This increased federal power. That is the main result of the Civil War. It increased federal power. Put a big fat giant star next to that. The Emancipation Proclamation was a massive increase in federal power. Civil liberties were suspended during the Civil War. Example was the writ of habeas corpus. Again, that right to be told what you're in jail for and also to have a trial. The federal government issues currency or paper money called greenbacks. It issues an income tax, which gives it more power and income. And Congress created laws without opposition. They had no one to say no anymore because the South was not involved in Congress, being part of their own nation. Economic changes during the Civil War. Southern economy was ruined and the Northern was booming. In the South, they were devastated economically. Their lands and businesses were destroyed, slavery was ended, and a blockade impeded exports and imports. In the North, however, production increased. Manufactured war supplies. Social changes. 620,000 people died, more than 500,000 were wounded. That is a massive loss. Every death in the Civil War is an American death. However, the 13th Amendment was passed, which abolished slavery. African Americans were free by law, yet continued to face discrimination and segregation throughout the country. Women had changing roles. They had taken jobs and ran farms while men were at war. They had shown their ability in the field as nurses, and their roles began to take a change. Congratulations, ladies and gentlemen, you have gotten through the video lecture. To make sure you know what you need to know, visit these 3 questions. Make sure you can answer them without having to look at your notes, and I will see you in class. Bye-bye.